Welcome Bumpy Johnson Uncensored, 1958, a year when Harlem was boiling with corruption, racial tension, and police brutality. 5 officers thought they could intimidate, humiliate, and break Bumpy Johnson behind closed doors. They cornered him, mocked him, and pushed him beyond the line until Bumpy smiled. That smile changed everything. What followed next didn't just shock Harlem. It shook the entire police department. The secret transfer of Bumpy Johnson to a remote detention room in 1958. In 1958, Bumpy Johnson was no stranger to police harassment, but this transfer was different. It wasn't official, it wasn't scheduled, and it sure wasn't normal procedure. According to insiders, shortly after his arrest, Bumpy was quietly removed from the main holding area. There were no fingerprints recorded, no paperwork filed, and no supervising officer signing off. It was a ghost transfer, the type done when someone wants to make sure there are no witnesses. 2 officers approached him with a calm voice, telling him they were moving him for further processing. But Bumpy instantly sensed something off. Their tone was too rehearsed. The hallways they walked were too empty, and the route they took wasn't toward any processing room he recognized from past arrests. Instead, they took a sharp turn down an unlit corridor rarely used, except for storage and interrogation, that didn't need to be logged. As they walked, the silence became heavier. Bumpy noticed the clicking of boots behind him more than 2 sets. He counted 5 shadows stretching across the walls. That's when he knew this wasn't a routine move. This was a setup. The officers led him to a small, isolated detention room that looked abandoned. The windows were covered with metal plating. The walls were scarred from years of fights, and the fluorescent light above flickered just enough to make the room feel unstable. No cameras, no guards, no witnesses. It was the perfect place for something dirty to happen. The moment the door shut behind him with a heavy metallic thud, Bumpy's suspicions were confirmed. He turned slightly and saw all 5 officers step inside, and one of them locked the door. They weren't there to question him. They were there to break him. What they didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't the type of man you could corner and expect to stay silent. Even in that tiny, forgotten room, surrounded and outnumbered, Bumpy stayed calm and even allowed a slow smile to form on his face. And that smile would become the beginning of a story Harlem would whisper about for years. The 5 officers didn't pick Bumpy Johnson at random. They'd been watching him for months, reading reports, listening to informants, and following every move he made in Harlem. Bumpy represented something they hated, a black man who refused to bow, refused to break, and refused to show fear in front of the badge. He walked with confidence, talked with precision, carried influence that even the NYPD couldn't ignore. Behind the scenes, these 5 officers had a private agenda. They met secretly in the station's basement break room. No cameras, no paperwork, no supervisors. The plan wasn't official. It wasn't approved. It was personal. Wanted to teach Bumpy a lesson, to send a message that even someone as feared as him could be humiliated. One officer, the loudest and angriest of the group, slammed his fist on the table and said, "Tonight, we break him. No slipping through cracks this time." Another officer, calmer but more dangerous, pulled out a small envelope. Inside were brass knuckles, leather gloves, and a small metal baton. Tools not issued by the department. Tools meant for pain, not enforcement. They agreed on the timing down to the minute. Wait until most supervisors went home. Wait until shift change left the hallways quiet. And wait until the cells were nearly empty. They wanted privacy. They wanted silence. And most of all, They wanted to ensure that if something went wrong, they could blame it on mate aggression. Underneath their bravado was something else, fear. They knew who they were dealing with. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a street-level hustler. He was educated, strategic, respected by Harlem, and connected to powerful figures. If the wrong person found out what they were planning, their careers and their lives could be in danger. Still, the officers convinced themselves this was their moment, a chance to knock a legend off his pedestal. They whispered among themselves about how Bumpy had embarrassed the department in court, how he made officers look weak when he refused to snitch, and how he walked into every room like he owned the place. They wanted to crush that confidence. They wanted to see him beg. But they miscalculated something important. Bumpy didn't fear pain. He didn't fear numbers. He didn't fear men who hid behind uniforms. As they finalized their plan, 5 grown, armed officers versus 1 unarmed prisoner, they reassured each other. He won't fight back. He's surrounded. They had no idea that they were walking into a showdown that would expose their weakness, destroy their plan, and become a whispered legend in Harlem for decades. The moment Bumpy Johnson stepped into that isolated detention room, he understood everything, the locked door behind him, the 5 officers circling like vultures, the flickering lights, the silence in the hallway. He'd been in dangerous rooms before, back alleys, basements, mob meetings, but this one carried a unique stench, the smell of a setup wrapped in a badge. Most men would panic, most men would shout, plead, or lose control, but Bumpy wasn't most men. He stood still, shoulders relaxed, eyes observing every detail like a chessboard. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't ask questions. He simply stood there with a calmness that made the officers even angrier. The first officer shoved him hard and barked, "Where's that big mouth now, Johnson?" Bumpy barely moved. His shoes scraped the floor slightly, but he stayed balanced. Instead of reacting, he looked the officer straight in the eyes and smiled. A slow, deliberate, unsettling smile that said a word. "You boys don't know what you've started." The officers exchanged confused glances. They expected fear, or at least frustration. Instead, they saw a man who seemed almost entertained. The second officer stepped forward, inches from Bumpy's face, spitting insults, trying to push him emotionally over the edge. Yet Bumpy's expression didn't change. He blinked slowly, as if bored. He shifted his jaw just enough to let the smile widen. That smile was psychological warfare. It rattled them. It made them wonder, why isn't he scared? What does he know that we don't? What is he planning? The third officer slammed a baton against the wall. Bench! The sound echoed through the metal room. Dust fell from the ceiling. The intimidation tactic was supposed to shake Bumpy's nerves, but Bumpy didn't even flinch. He kept smiling. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was calculation. Bumpy was reading each officer, studying height, weight, stance, breathing, tension in their shoulders, how they held their weapons, who led and who followed. He was mapping the room, noting exits, blind spots, weaknesses. Every second they spent trying to intimidate him only gave him more time to prepare. And the officers could feel it. One of them muttered under his breath, "He's planning something." Another snapped back, "Nah, he's bluffing." None of them truly believed that. They could see it in his eyes. Bumpy wasn't trapped. He was waiting for the moment they made the first mistake. And it was coming. The more they pushed him, the more he smiled, and the more his silence screamed loud enough to shake the rooms. "You think you're hunting me, but you've just walked into my game. The temperature in that small detention room shifted the moment the officers realized Bumpy wasn't reacting the way they expected. His calmness, that eerie smile, the unblinking stare, it was working on them. What started as their power play was slowly turning into their psychological collapse. Then it happened. The moment that flipped everything. The boldest officer, the one who initiated the plan, the one who swore he would, Break Bumpy himself, stepped forward again, but this time with frustration instead of confidence. His ego couldn't handle the lack of fear from a man surrounded by 5 badges. His breathing became uneven. His hands shook slightly. His jaw tightened. He was losing control. He made the mistake that seasoned officers know to avoid. He got too close. He leaned in, inches from Bumpy's face, yelling insults so loudly that the spit hit Bumpy's cheek. He wanted a reaction. He needed Bumpy to crack. It was personal now, professional, not tactical, emotional. And that's when he made the fatal error. He grabbed Bumpy by the collar with one hand. It was impulsive. It was sloppy. It was exactly what Bumpy had been waiting for. The room froze. For half a second, everything went silent. The other officers recognized the danger, but too late. Because the moment that grip tightened, Bumpy moved with the precision of a man who'd been in more fights than all 5 officers combined. He didn't swing wildly. He didn't panic. He executed a controlled, strategic counter, quick, efficient, and devastating. With one sharp movement, Bumpy twisted his torso, trapping the officer's arm between his elbow and chest, and leveraged the officer's own weight. A simple pivot, a shoulder drop, and snap. The officer fell forward, losing balance. Bumpy used the momentum to throw him against the wall. The sound echoed like thunder. The officer hit the metal panel so hard that the fluorescent tube above flickered violently. His baton clattered across the floor, spinning. Dust fell from the ceiling. The other 4 officers stared in disbelief. Because it happened so fast, they barely registered it. And Bumpy, he straightened his shirt, he adjusted his collar, and he smiled again, even wider this time. Smile was no longer just psychological warfare, it was a warning. The officer on the ground groaned, trying to stand. His wrist was twisted badly, possibly dislocated. His pride was shattered. The others panicked, because they suddenly understood the new reality. Bumpy wasn't cornered, they were. One officer shouted, "Don't let him move! Don't let him move!" But the fear was already spreading. They were no longer executing a plan. They were reacting, scrambling, unprepared. Bumpy had flipped the power dynamic with a single calculated move. No weapon, no backup, just strategy, timing, and control. And now, the officers weren't thinking about teaching a lesson. They were thinking about survival. The moment the first officer hit the wall, Bumpy Johnson understood something the officers didn't. The room itself was his greatest weapon. It was cramped, narrow, and poorly lit. A space where numbers didn't matter. 5 officers or 50. The tight quarters made it impossible for them to attack all at once. Only 1 or 2 could reach him at a time, and Bumpy knew how to exploit that perfectly. While the injured officer groaned on the floor, the others panicked and tried to surround him again. But in a room barely wider than 2 steps, surrounding him was impossible. They bumped into each other, elbowing each other out of position, trying to get close without blocking their partners. It turned their advantage into chaos. Bumpy saw the confusion spreading through them like wildfire. He stepped backward, not in retreat, in calculation, placing his back against the corner of the room. Now, no one could get behind him. It forced all 5 men into a funnel in front of him, restricting their movement even more. This was chess, not brawling, and Bumpy was playing 5 pawns at once. The second officer tried to rush him, running forward with his baton raised. But because of the tight space, the officer couldn't swing properly. His arm scraped the wall, and his angle was off. Bumpy waited until the last fraction of a second, then shifted his weight and ducked low. The baton smashed into the metal wall instead of Bumpy's head, sending a jolt up the officer's arm. Before the officer could recover, Bumpy seized the opening. He grabbed the officer's wrist, twisted sharply, and used the man's forward momentum to throw him sideways, straight into the third officer who was trying to squeeze in. Both men crashed together like dominoes. The small room magnified every impact. The walls rattled. The officers grunted and stumbled over each other, tripping on the baton rolling under their feet. Their boots clattered on the concrete floor as they tried to regain balance. But Bumpy had already moved again. He slid along the wall, using every inch of the narrow space to corner the officers instead of letting them corner him. Each move was deliberate, precise, like he was dancing inside a cage that he knew better than his enemies. The room's limitations became his shield. The flickering fluorescent light above added to the chaos. Shadows stretched and snapped with every movement, making it harder for the officers to judge distance. Bumpy used that too. He positioned himself under the light so their vision kept adjusting as the bulb flickered, giving him micro-seconds of advantage. Another officer lunged with a punch, but the confined space forced him to overextend. Bumpy sidestepped just enough to let the punch graze past, then drove his elbow into the man's ribs. A quick, decisive strike that made the officer gasp and stumble backward, knocking into the man behind him. The room was turning against them. The walls were closing in. They couldn't move freely. They couldn't coordinate. They couldn't breathe. But Bumpy could. All the space he needed. Just enough space to read, react, and strike. And the officers, men who believed numbers and badges made them unstoppable, found themselves trapped in a cage with someone who knew exactly how to use it to his advantage. By now, panic had replaced bravado, fear had replaced confidence, and Bumpy's calm smile, it never faded. Just when the room had turned into a whirlwind of chaos, officers stumbling, bruised, disoriented, and Bumpy controlling every inch of space, something happened that none of them expected. The doorknob rattled, not the aggressive, angry turn of another officer joining the ambush, the commanding twist of a supervisor intervening. It was a soft, confused jiggle, almost hesitant. The 5 officers froze mid-movement. Bumpy paused, his chest rising calmly, eyes shifting toward the door. The metal door creaked open, and standing there, wide-eyed, frozen, stunned, was a young cadet no more than 21 years old. He was new to the precinct, new to the badge, and completely unaware he had just stepped into a nightmare. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't briefed on anything. He had simply been sent on a routine check to confirm the room was empty. When he saw the scene inside, his face went pale. 5 senior officers circling an unarmed inmate, 2 men on the floor, a baton lying across the concrete, and Bumpy Johnson, standing strong, unfazed, commanding the room without saying a word. The cadet's breathing hitched. His hand twitched toward his holster, not to draw, but out of fear and confusion. His instinct told him something was wrong. Very wrong. The officers immediately snapped. "One officer barked, 'Get out! This doesn't concern you!'" Another shoved the door halfway closed, trying to block the cadet's view, but it was too late. He had seen everything. The cadet stammered, "What's going on? This room is supposed to be empty." And there it was, the sentence that destroyed their entire plan. Bumpy didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to. He watched the scene unfold with the calm of a man who knew the world had just tilted in his favor. He could see the fear rising in the officer's eyes, the panic of exposure, the realization that a witness, an innocent one, could unravel everything. The leading officer anxiously stepped toward the cadet, trying to intimidate him into silence. "Close the door and forget what you saw." But the cadet didn't budge. His eyes kept darting between Bumpy and the injured officers on the ground, putting the pieces together in real time. He swallowed hard. You could see his conscience fighting his fear. He whispered, barely audible, I have to report this." Those 6 words changed the entire energy in the room. The officers panicked. Their plan was collapsing. Their careers, their reputations, their safety, all hanging by a thread. They couldn't intimidate the cadet. They couldn't threaten him. He was a rookie, honest, uncorrupted, terrified, Bumpy. He didn't say a single word, but the smile slowly returned to his face, a different kind of smile this time. Not one of intimidation, not one of confidence, but of inevitability. Because now, with one unexpected witness, the officers weren't just dealing with a prisoner. They were dealing with consequences, and Bumpy Johnson knew it. The officers scrambled to figure out their next move. The cadet stood frozen in shock, and for the first time that night, the power in that room no longer belonged to the 5 officers. The moment the cadet stumbled out of that detention room, pale and shaken, the entire atmosphere in the station changed. He didn't run, he didn't shout, but his face told the story. Other officers saw him trembling, sweating, barely able to form a sentence. His uniform wasn't wrinkled from a scuffle, but his mind was. And that was enough. He whispered something to a desk sergeant. That sergeant whispered something to a clerk. The clerk whispered something to a night shift officer in the hallway. And just like that, the rumor began. Nothing spreads faster than fear, except a story involving Bumpy Johnson. Within an hour, a few officers who respected Bumpy quietly slipped out of the precinct and made calls to Harlem. These were not gangsters. These were residents, people who'd seen Bumpy help families, protect small businesses, and keep certain streets safe when the police wouldn't. They knew something was wrong. One call went to a gambling spot on 147th Street. Another went to a barber shop on Lenox Avenue. A third to a jazz club where Bumpy's associates often met. Each call had the same message. They're trying to hurt Bumpy. 5 cops. Off the record. It's bad. Harlem moved fast, faster than the NYPD ever realized. Within 2 hours, people were stepping out of their apartments, gathering in small clusters, whispering in doorways. Street corners buzzed. Taxi drivers passed messages window to window. Newspaper stands stopped selling papers and started sharing the breaking story instead. By 4 hours, the rumor grew legs. Some said 5 officers jumped Bumpy. Others said 10. Some claimed Bumpy fought them all off and walked out untouched. No one knew the exact truth, but everyone agreed on one thing. The police were trying to break Harlem's man, and Harlem wasn't going to stay quiet. In the Apollo Theater lobby, the story echoed between performers and stagehands. In the back rooms of small diners, old-timers recalled similar police setups from the past. In the streets, kids ran around repeating exaggerated versions they overheard from adults. People didn't need confirmation. They believed the streets more than they believed the police. By midnight, Harlem's entire energy had shifted. There was tension in the air, shops that stayed open late closed early. Men stood outside on stoops, with arms folded, watching silently. Women gathered at windows, whispering worrying. Bumpy wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of strength in a world where black men were constantly targeted. So when word spread that the police were trying to hurt him, Harlem felt attacked too. And there was another layer to the rumor, one that made the situation even more volatile. Someone claimed Bumpy had already injured officers inside the precinct. Someone else said one officer was carried out unconscious. Someone said the FBI might get involved. Rumors mixed with fear, fear mixed with anger, anger mixed with loyalty. And soon, the entire neighborhood was vibrating with anticipation, waiting for the next update, waiting to see if Bumpy would walk out of that precinct alive. For the NYPD, this wasn't just a disciplinary issue anymore. It was a potential community explosion. And all of it started with a single witness, the cadet who should never have been there, accidentally exposing what was supposed to remain hidden. Harlem now knew. Harlem was watching, and Harlem was getting ready to respond. Inside the detention room, the situation was spiraling out of control. 2 officers were already down, one gripping his wrist with a twisted angle, the other struggling to breathe after taking a strike to the ribs. The remaining 3 stood in varying states of panic, sweat dripping, adrenaline crashing, and fear swelling. These were trained officers, men who believed they could overpower one unarmed prisoner. Yet now they were the ones injured, humiliated, and losing control. But the injuries themselves weren't the department's biggest problem. The real problem was who caused them. Bumpy Johnson, a name heavy enough to shake a precinct, a man connected deeply enough to make retaliation a real possibility, a figure respected enough in Harlem that any harm done to him could ignite the streets. When the rookie cadet reported what he saw to a supervising sergeant, whispers began racing through the precinct faster than the officers could handle. A supervisor rushed down the hallway, heart pounding, terrified of what he would find. He pushed open the detention room door and froze. He saw the officers slumped against the wall. He saw the baton on the floor. He saw Bumpy standing calmly in the corner, like he owned the room. But what shook him the most was the officers' faces. Fear, not dominance. The supervisor immediately slammed the door shut and turned to the officers outside. "Nobody talks about this," he snapped. He ordered 2 men to help the injured officers to the medical room, but quietly, discreetly, away from the main hallway where other officers and staff could see them. The officer, with the twisted wrist, was nearly howling in pain. "Shut him up!" The supervisor hissed through clenched teeth. But pain can't be silenced. They wrapped his arm in a coat and rushed him down the hallway. The officer with rib damage couldn't stand upright. Every breath was a struggle. They tried to walk him out with dignity, but he collapsed twice. The medical staff immediately asked what happened to them. But the supervisor leaned in and whispered a lie. "Training accident." Put it on the report. Even the medics didn't buy it. Nobody breaks ribs in a training accident inside a detention room, but they didn't question it out loud. They knew better. Meanwhile, the 3 remaining officers were being dragged into a small briefing room for damage control. Their leader had a swollen cheekbone. Another had a torn uniform sleeve and a bruised shoulder. The third's lip was split open, shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. They didn't just lose control of the situation, they lost pride, reputation, and authority. The supervisor paced the room, furious and terrified at the same time. "Do you know what you've done?" he shouted. "If Harlem gets wind of this, we're finished." But Harlem already knew. The officers realized the gravity of the situation. They had tried to break a man, But instead, Bumpy broke their plan and their bodies. Worse, they knew that if word got out, they could lose their badges, they could face lawsuits, they could trigger riots, and the department itself would be accused of corruption and brutality. So they scrambled to create a cover story. They agreed to say Bumpy became aggressive, and they acted in self-defense. They planned to claim he attacked first. They decided to leave out their illegal meeting, their weapons, and the rookie witness. But as they rehearsed their lies, the supervisor said the quiet part out loud. The problem isn't what happened in this room. The problem is what people think happened. Because perception could destroy them even before the truth ever came out. 5 officers injured by one man wasn't just embarrassing. It was explosive, and no matter how many lies they wrote on paper, the truth was crawling out faster than they could stop it. While chaos unfolded inside the precinct, Harlem wasn't sitting still. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just one man, he was a network, a system, a shadow government in his own neighborhood. And the moment word spread that something was wrong, his allies moved quickly, quietly, and with precision. It started with a phone call to a man known only as the Professor. He wasn't a criminal, he was a strategist, a former numbers expert who now handled Bumpy's communications. He gathered information faster than the police department could blink. When he heard that 5 officers attempted to rough Bumpy up off the record, he didn't panic, he mobilized. First, he contacted Bumpy's closest street associates, men who handled everything from business deals to conflict mediation. They didn't storm the precinct or start protests. That wasn't their style. Instead, they visited key community figures, barbers, boxers, preachers, shop owners, and instructed them in calm, controlled voices. Stay ready, don't act yet. But stay ready. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, a collective inhale before the eruption. But the real pressure came from people the police never expected. Panakala Fe one, a judge's hint, a local judge who had always admired Bumpy for his intelligence and influence, placed a discreet call to a high-ranking NYPD inspector. I heard something troubling. If anything happens to Mr. Johnson tonight, you're going to have political problems. The inspector stiffened. Judges almost never intervened directly. Call alone sent shockwaves upward through the chain of command. Pankal Fe 2, a newspaper editor's shadow warning. Then, a call came from a Harlem newspaper editor, someone with connections in both the black community and mainstream media. He said one sentence: "If Bumpy comes out bruised, this city will read about it first thing tomorrow." That wasn't a threat either. It was a guarantee. The editor understood the power of headlines. He knew one good article could spark outrage across the city, and the NYPD didn't want that kind of smoke. Pankal Fe 3, the Italian connection. But the call that truly shook NYPD leadership came from someone unexpected, an Italian numbers runner with connections to higher-level organized crime. He phoned a precinct captain directly. His tone was calm, but ice cold. "Why, hear something happened to Mr. Johnson. If he doesn't walk out of there breathing and whole, certain alliances are going to break, and that won't be good for business." That call sent chills down the captain's spine, because the NYPD could ignore Harlem, but they couldn't ignore the mafia. If the Italians were involved, the stakes had just multiplied. Not because they cared about Bumpy personally, but because Bumpy was a link in a delicate chain of business arrangements. Harming him meant disrupting money flow, and that was bad for everyone. Harlem streets began to shift within a few hours. Harlem became eerily organized, not chaotic, not loud, organized Men stood on corners in groups of 3 or 4, silent, watching. Car engines idled in front of the precinct, not blocking, just present. Mothers kept their children indoors. Business owners locked doors earlier than usual. Everyone was waiting, not for violence, but for confirmation that Bumpy was safe. NYPD leadership feels the pressure. By midnight, NYPD leadership held an emergency internal meeting. 5 officers injured. A cadet witness. Rumors spreading through Harlem. Possible press involvement. Potential mafia involvement. Captain slammed his fist on the desk. We need to de-escalate now. But how? Their own men were injured. Their cover story was weak. Their control of the narrative was gone. And worst of all, they knew Harlem wouldn't accept a lie. So the leadership did the only thing they could do. They ordered the officers to back off. They instructed medical staff to treat Bumpy immediately. They demanded a written report be rewritten to remove inconsistencies. And then they prepared for the most critical moment of the night, walking Bumpy Johnson out of that precinct alive, unbroken, and in full view. Because they knew the truth. If Bumpy walked out harmed, Harlem would erupt. But if Bumpy walked out calm, composed, unshaken, then the message would be delivered without a single shot fired. Hours passed, phones rang, rumors spread, pressure built like steam inside a locked boiler. Inside the precinct, NYPD leadership had no choice left. The officers' ambush had failed. Their cover story was collapsing. Harlem was awake, alert, and gathering. And most importantly, everyone was waiting to see Bumpy Johnson walk out alive. By the time the clock approached 27:00 a.m., hundreds of people had drifted quietly toward the precinct. They didn't shout. They didn't throw anything. They didn't cause trouble. Harlem wasn't there for chaos. Harlem was there for witness. Men leaned against parked cars. Elders sat on stoops with arms folded. Women watched anxiously from apartment windows. Business owners stood in their doorways in silence. It wasn't a protest, it was a message. We're here, and we're watching. The precinct doors remained closed, but Harlem's patience did not crack. The police felt the eyes of the neighborhood pressing against the walls like a physical weight. Finally, the moment arrived. The heavy metal doors opened. 2 officers stepped out first, not the ones who tried to attack him, but fresh faces, nervous and stiff. They stood on either side of the doorway as if presenting something or someone. Then he appeared. Bumpy Johnson. Calm, upright, unbroken, not limping, not bruised, not shaken. He walked out with the same steady pace he had when he walked in hours earlier. His hat sat perfectly on his head. His coat was straight. His expression was composed. But behind his eyes burned a fire of absolute control. The silent crowd shifted as one. No cheers, no applause, no shouting, just a deep, collective exhale, the kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for hours. Bumpy paused at the top of the steps. He looked at Harlem with anger, not with fear, but with a slow nod that said more than words ever could. I'm fine. Stand down. It was a command and a reassurance wrapped into one, and the crowd understood instantly. The officers at the door swallowed hard. They had never seen anything like this, a man walking out of a police precinct with more authority than the police themselves. Bumpy stepped forward down the stairs. A path opened for him automatically, the crowd clearing without a single word spoken. He didn't rush. He didn't glance back. His stride was confident, controlled, like a king leaving a courtroom, not a prisoner leaving custody. People watched him with respect, with loyalty, with pride. Behind him, the officers stayed planted at the doorway, not daring to move. They were terrified that the smallest gesture could ignite the crowd. But Harlem didn't need violence tonight. They got what they came for. Bumpy walking out whole meant the plan to break him had failed. The precinct had been forced to fold. The officers' scheme had collapsed under pressure, and Harlem had won without lifting a single fist. Bumpy reached the edge of the crowd. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, stepped forward. He didn't speak. He just looked up at Bumpy with wide eyes. Bumpy placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, nodded once, and kept walking. Small gesture sent chills through the entire street. It symbolized something deeper. Bumpy wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a neighborhood, a generation, a community tired of being intimidated and mistreated. As he walked away, Harlem slowly dispersed, quietly, respectfully, returning to their homes, satisfied with the outcome. And inside the precinct, the officers realized something terrifying. They hadn't just failed to break Bumpy Johnson. They'd made him even stronger. They had turned him into a legend. When the chaos finally settled, the corridor looked like a battleground. Officers groaning on the floor, uniforms ripped, equipment scattered. Bumpy stood in the center of it all, breathing heavy, bruised, blood on his jaw, but standing tall. His eyes were steady, not wild, not panicked, just calm and cold, like a man who had seen worse and survived worse. The officers, realizing how badly the situation had spiraled, scrambled to get their story straight. They whispered excuses, tried to pick each other off the floor, and rehearsed lies before supervisors showed up. But here's what they didn't expect. A supervisor rounded the corner just in time to see the end of the chaos. He saw Bumpy standing calmly. He saw multiple officers on the ground. He saw unissued weapons scattered, and he immediately knew something wasn't right. One officer tried to speak first, panting, pointing at Bumpy.
"He attacked us?"
But the supervisor didn't buy it. Not for a second. He studied the scene, then asked a question that froze the rooms. All 5 of you, attacked by one unarmed man. Silence. He ordered the officers to stand up straight. Most couldn't. He told them to explain why non-department gear was on the floor. No one spoke. He told them to explain why there was no paperwork logged for this. Inmate escort. Again, silence. And then came the words the officers dreaded. Internal Affairs will handle this. You could hear the air get sucked out of the room. For Bumpy, the consequences were completely different. He wasn't disciplined. He wasn't sent to solitary. He wasn't written up. The supervisor, who didn't like him but respected rules, simply nodded and said, Johnson, go back to your cell. And Bumpy walked. He didn't limp. He didn't stumble. He walked with the same measured, regal pace that he always carried, like the king of Harlem, even behind bars. As he passed the injured officers, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't insult them. He just said quietly, next time, come honest, not loud, not threatening, just steady. Over the next weeks, the fallout spread. 3 officers were suspended. 2 were moved to other districts. 1 faced a full investigation. And whispers spread through the department that the 5 of them had tried to ambush Bumpy Johnson and got destroyed by their own arrogance. The officers had wanted to break his spirit, but instead they broke their own reputations. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Bumpy became a legend overnight. Word traveled cell to cell, inmate to inmate, guard to guard. Some guards nodded at him with new respect. Inmates whispered his name like he was a myth. He had walked into a trap and walked out undefeated, bruised on the outside, untouchable on the inside. The moment the news slipped out of the prison walls, it traveled through Harlem like electricity. At first, it came as a quiet whisper, passed from one inmate's relative to another, from a guard who talked too much at a bar, from a clerk who overheard internal reports. Nobody had the full story, but everyone knew the headline. 5 officers tried to break Bumpy and failed. By the next morning, barbershops were buzzing. Men leaned in close to tell the story like they were delivering a secret from the underworld. One man said Bumpy took down all 5 alone. Another claimed he stood still while they exhausted themselves. A third said he didn't even hit them, just blocked and dodged until they gave up. Every retelling made the story bigger. Street vendors argued about the details. Taxi drivers passed the rumor between fares. Corner bookmakers laughed, saying, "If you bet against Bumpy, you deserve to lose your money." Even the churches heard it. Deacons, who normally didn't speak on street business, raised eyebrows. Choir members shared the story after rehearsal. Harlem loved strength, especially strength that stood up to corruption and humiliation. The story didn't stay in Harlem. It drifted beyond. Nightclubs downtown talked about it. Italian crews in Little Italy heard about it and nodded in respect. Politicians whispered about it behind closed doors. Journalists couldn't print it, but they knew it. And inside Harlem, Bumpy's legend grew into something bigger than a man. He became a symbol, someone who stood tall when others were expected to kneel, someone who wouldn't be broken even by the system designed to break him. Kids in the neighborhood pretended to be Bumpy in schoolyard games. Young hustlers bragged about meeting him. Older men told the story with pride in their voices, like Harlem itself had punched back at injustice. The myth grew each day. Armed officers, one unarmed man, and Bumpy walked out on his feet. Whether every detail was true didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what the story represented: resistance, pride, defiance, and the refusal to bow to people who abused their power. Even years later, long after the bruises faded and the officers had moved on, the legend remained. Anyone who mentioned Bumpy Johnson's name in Harlem would hear someone say, "You know what he did to those 5 officers, right?" It became part of his identity, part of Harlem's identity, and part of the myth that still surrounds him today. Because in 1958, behind cold prison walls, Bumpy did more than defend himself. He defended the idea that dignity belongs to you, and no one gets to take it unless you hand it over. And Bumpy never handed anything over.